Professor Tina O'Toole has taken an MA in Women's Studies at UCD and a PhD on 19th century literature at UCC. She has worked for 3 years as Principal Project Researcher on the Women in Irish Society project, which resulted in the Dictionary of Munster Women Writers 2005 and a study of the second wave Irish women's movement, documenting Irish feminisms 2005, co-authored with Linda Connolly. She also held a Women's Studies Fellowship at the University of Ottawa in 2001, where she developed an archival project on Irish and Canadian feminist activism. Subsequently, she was awarded an IRCHSS postdoctoral fellowship at UCC in 2002 and an Irish Studies Fellowship at Queen's University Belfast in 2003. She has worked as a lecturer in English at University of Limerick since 2004. In 2005, she was appointed Assistant Dean for Academic Affairs for the Faculty of Arts, Humanities and Social Science for a 3-year term. She has since served twice as Subject Head of English and as Course Director for the BA New Media and English and the BA English and History. She was an elected board member of the Royal Irish Academy Committee for Literatures in English 2009-13 and is currently an editorial board member of the Irish University Review, Edinburgh University Press. She has been an executive member of the International Association for the Study of Irish Literatures, one of the main international associations of the profession, since 2014, and has served as treasurer over the same period. Her scholarship focuses on Irish women's writing, the history of sexualities, and on Irish migrant and transnational literatures. Ongoing projects extend her interest in fin de siècle culture. Her recent monograph, The Irish New Woman, was published by Palgrave Macmillan in 2013. Her current research explores women's war writing as part of a collaborative project on women and war, Ireland 1880 to 1922. This is a gender arc project with colleagues from NUIG and Queen's Belfast. She is currently developing new research projects on Irish literary migrancies and on the representation of sexualities in 20th century Irish culture.
Thanks, Sharon. Great. Thank you very much. Thank you. It's lovely to be back at USP. It really is. I'm delighted to be here. I'm delighted to follow the emerging careers of so many of your brilliant young scholars, whom I saw at an earlier stage in their work. Sharon ended by talking about the work that I've been doing on migration, and that's really how the link between USP and UL came about, because Laura and I collaborated on a project on Irish women's migrant writing. And it seems like a good place for me to begin, really, talking today, because that's really the main subject of my paper. But I just wanted to mention, just very briefly, the link with the University of Limerick, which we're really pleased with, we're really proud of. And migration and literary migration in particular has been central to that. So we had Rosario Coelho with us last year working on her project on Colin McCann and migrant writing, and we continue the WB8 scholarship, which enables students from here to take our MA. So we're very pleased with this ongoing link, and I'm as always very happy to be back among friends and colleagues here. Transnational kinship networks have become clearly visible in the scholarship of the Irish diaspora in recent years. However, such networks predate the contemporary period, and arguably the development of radical politics in early 20th century Ireland depended upon them. Those like Roger Casement, who found themselves outside the structures and definitions of their family of origin, circumvented fixed heteronormative and patriarchal structures by creating lateral support networks of their own, alternatives to hierarchical family structures. Focusing on the women writers and activists who influenced and supported Roger Casement's radical nationalist politics, this paper considers the ways in which their chosen kinship group, which centred on the Glens of Antrim. So I'm following Jane unwittingly by focusing on this northeastern corner again, but just for those of you who don't know who haven't been to Murlock Bay, I couldn't resist bringing it with me today. So it's here. So we have this group that's centred in the Glens of Antrim in the north of Ireland, but operating transnationally across the wider colonial world, unsettling fixities of family and national affinity in Irish culture. And the ambassador earlier mentioned the multiple identities and traditions that we're now beginning to explore in the culture, and really Casement enables that, facilitates that in so many ways. 3 key women, Alice Stopford Green, Eva Gorbooth and Gertrude Bannister, came to public attention during Casement's trial and were central to the campaign for clemency. All 3 might be described in the terms of the period as new women, as I will explain. One especially memorable moment in their campaign was the petition that they brought in person to George V on the day before Casement's execution. But long before that moment, and long before this court scene painted by Lavery, these 3 women, along with a wider group of fellow travellers, had been an important influence in the shaping of Casement's nationalist sensibilities. By attending to Casement as a member of as a member of a community, a wider kinship group, my work questions the tendency to see Irish revolutionaries as unique, exceptional men, existing in isolation from their wider social network. So exploring Casement's writing and activism in tandem with that of this circle of new women writers reveals the influence they had on him, on his Irish nationalist education and politics. And moreover, this approach offers new insights into the nation-building process in Ireland, specifically in relation to the gendering of national identities in the period and since. Everybody can hear me, right? So he's just being careful about the microphone. Okay. While Casement's trials strengthened the ties between his women friends, their central importance in his life and identity formation are evident from his early adulthood onwards. Having cast off from the Casements of Mahon Temple, Casement developed and carefully maintained a transnational kinship network of his own. I'm just going to show you some of the key people in this. So Robert and Sylvia Lind were part of this group. This is Alice Stopford Green, whose black and white photograph unfortunately doesn't show us her flaming red hair. I'm just trying to give you a sense of these people. So his sister Nina in Portrush, and these friends, the Linds, introduced Casement to a network of radical writers and Irish nationalist activists. And this coterie did include, of course, male friends and colleagues like Francis Joseph Bigger and Bulmer Hobson, to name but 2. Several close women friends and family members were part of his intimate circle throughout his life. So his Bannister cousins, Gertrude and Elizabeth in Liverpool, the Youngs, the Young family, Rose and Charlotte, to whom Casement sent his love from the Tower of London. Stopford Green, this is Rose Young. Stopford Green, whom I've mentioned. Alice Milligan, who's part of the Glens Fesh group, which I'm going to talk about in a moment. Okay. And obviously, I'm putting in Hobson and Bigger as well. So this is the group, really, more or less, who are part of that very famous initiative, intervention in cultural nationalism in 1904 in the Glens of Antrim. And I'll be coming back to talk about that today. So Casement's radical circle in the Glens of Antrim then include some of these women, particularly the Youngs, Rose and Charlotte Young, Ada MacNeil, Margaret Dobbs and Margaret Hutton, among others. And the exchanges between them created the first Glens Fesh that was held in Glenariff, which is near Waterfoot, held in Waterfoot near Glenariff in 1904. These people were part of the original group. A significant number of these women were perceived as political radicals or new women, to use the term of the period. In other words, they were part of a culture of newly empowered, educated, active and radical women in Ireland. Scholars, educators, artists, writers who openly professed first-wave feminist ambitions and were engaged in public discourse and social activism of one kind or another. So in England, we all know about the suffrage wars and the class wars of the period. In Ireland, these women really focused their attentions on cultural nationalist movements. In order to explain what may seem like the surprising radicalism of these carefully brought up daughters of the Antrim upper and middle classes, especially in relation to their Irish nationalist adherents, we need only look back a decade to the Ladies' Land League and the work of Anna Parnell. They clearly provided a blueprint, not only in terms of gender, but also in terms of cross-community membership. During the short-lived career of the Ladies' Land League, women speakers, particularly Anna Parnell herself, spoke on platforms at mass meetings. And they would have been the first women that other women would have seen on public platforms in Ireland, all over the island. In the same period, a formative one for the revolutionary generation, whom I'm talking about, the feminist new woman figure became a common phenomenon in popular culture, and indeed one of Casement's own circle, Agnes O'Farrelly, wrote an Irish language new woman novel, Grá agus Crá. So new woman novels turned on this fictional character who gains confidence in her ability to voice her rights and is ultimately willing to fight for them. Sarah Grand, who wrote The Heavenly Twins, is probably the best known new woman novelist. Her landmark essay, The New Aspect of the Woman Question, from 1894, brought the term new woman into being. There is a connection because Grand, who was a hugely successful author and a figurehead, a member of the Pioneer Club in London, who spoke on suffrage platforms and so on. Grand originally came from Donaghadee in County Down, and I'm really sorry that your Jessica isn't here today because we were talking about Donaghadee at the consular event the other evening, which I thought was really the last place I'd find myself talking about Donaghadee. So Grand came from Donaghadee in County Down and may well have been a role model, this local writer who was just down the road from the Glens of Antrim. The creation of these fictional feminists, of course, makes room for their readers, a generation of newly educated young women, to follow in the footsteps of their literary heroines. And so we have the imbrication of social activism and literary representation. So then if these young women in Antrim were coming to consciousness at the end of the 19th century in a context suffused by the national struggle, it's no surprise that they saw their radicalism as belonging within that public discourse. The term new woman then denoted the challenges posed to the dominant culture by newly autonomous women, women just like Alice Green, Eva Gorbooth and G. Bannister, in fact. In order to understand and contextualise Casement's involvement with this group, I'm going to very briefly consider some of the processes through which contemporary identity narratives were constructed, deconstructed, and written as counter-narratives at the time, because obviously Casement and his circle played an active role in that process. To engage with national politics and national conflicts in Ireland in that period between the land war and partition meant grappling with gender norms and expectations too, through which distinctive modes of patriotic action could be validated or naturalised, but also reinterpreted or condemned. On the international stage, as Jane so masterfully did earlier, those imperial and colonial conflicts of the late 19th century had opened up new concepts of space and national identity, while the First World War produced a sustained re-evaluation of class and national culture. In such a context of militarisms and masculinities, let me turn to Casement then. How does he fit into this? What's his socialisation like in this period? We tend to think of him as someone who was socialised as an empire boy, to use Joe Bristow's term, in the diocesan school in Ballymena in the late 1870s. The qualities of the idealised boy bound up with the imperial project is evident through the culture of the period. In his nuanced treatment of manliness in the second half of the 19th century, Joe Valente observes a change in the hegemonic construction of masculinity between what he called the moralised forms of mid-century and the rugged forms geared to a more belligerently imperialist fin de siècle, which is instructive, I think, in relation to Casement. Against this backdrop, he emerges as a man who's shaped, I think, by the earlier moralised forms, but cast adrift in a time and place where the more rugged and belligerent imperialist forms held sway. It seems to me that this is one way that we may read Casement's humanitarian impulse and also his deeply felt investment in righting social wrongs. Simultaneously, his career became suffused with nationalism and patriotic values. In his later personal myth-making, he constructed an education based solely on imperialist maps and imagery, just like the fictional Stephen Dedalus in A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. So in this much-quoted letter, which you will all know, I think, Casement compares his school unfavourably to Padraig Pearse's school, St Enda's in Ranelagh. What's undisputed in the letter is the sense that his migrancy was predetermined. He was equipped for export, as he put it. His personal papers uncover the sense of restriction and enclosure he experienced at home with his father's family, among whom he seems to have been really an unwanted charity case. Moreover, in a poem written in his 30s, The Nameless One, which is held among the Maloney papers at the New York Public Library, Lucy McDermott found another motivation for his decision to leave Ireland. In the poem, Casement writes, "I sought by love alone to go where God had writ an awful no." And no, I'm not getting into the aesthetics of his poetry. On the back of the page, it's not coming up, I don't think. No, sorry about that. It's not coming up in the scan. Anyway, on the back of the page, you can find this in Lucy's Irish Art of Controversy. She has some excellent source material there. Casement had scribbled the following lines written in very great dejection at Genoa, November 15th, 1900, before sailing on the Sirio for Barcelona. So we get a sense of his sense of desolation and lack of self-worth in 1900. Needless to say, Casement wasn't the first Irish sexual dissident to banish himself to the far end of the earth away from his family and local community. Once self-exiled, the postings he chose or ended up in at the start of his career seem almost designed to ensure that he would be isolated from others of his class and even his own language group in some places. This can hardly be coincidental, it seems to me, and it correlates with himself, with his sense of himself, at least here, as a social outcast, as someone who needs to leave his own people and bourgeois Western culture behind. But you'll be relieved to hear this is not one of those tragic stories of exiled and tormented gay life. It's quite the opposite, in fact. Casement thrived on his complex global lifestyle. He developed an expansive network of friends, lovers, and political allies across 3 continents. He's best known, as everybody here today knows, as an international human rights activist, and his campaigns to highlight colonial exploitation affected important changes in relationships between colonizer and colonised. As a direct result of his investigations and advocacy for Indigenous peoples on 2 continents, increasingly he began to turn his attention back home. Most studies of Casement focus on, today I think, on his global reputation. But crucially, it seems to me that his investment in localism is what characterises his life and work. He immersed himself in the local places he inhabited, and it was his intimacy and the friendships that he created with the locals. That's really what characterises the case studies that he writes in his reports. Returning to Ireland, just as the cultural revolution of the fin de siècle began to deepen, he relied on his network in the glens of Antrim to give him access to the culture there. Given the prevailing educational climate on the island in the mid to late 19th century, those looking for an Irish nationalist context of any kind, a counter-narrative to prevailing British culture, had to dig deep in order to excavate or create it for themselves, and that's precisely what Casement and his friends set out to do. So who were these friends then? And as I've said, many of them were based in the glens of Antrim, in his local place. Their cultural revolution was thus embedded in and launched from that northeastern corner of Ireland. The vehicle for bringing many of these people together in the glens in the first place, including Rose Young, Dobbs and Hutton, was an initiative to revive the Irish language, the Gaelic League, founded in 1893 by Douglas Hyde. And this is one of the Gaelic League Irish College's photographs. The summer school, the typical summer school photograph that many of us might recognise, those of us who grew up in Ireland. And you can see Casement here on the far side of the photograph. So the Gaelic League then, as Margaret McCurtain and others have observed, was the first nationalist organisation in Ireland after the Land League to involve women on an equal footing with men. Furthermore, as Diarmuid O'Divlin observes, it really was a mixed class background, because you had frequently middle-class people going from urban areas out to rural parts of the country, like Rathlin Island or the Glens, to learn Irish from rural people. I mean, those of you, if there are Irish language scholars here, you'll know, of course, that the Irish language persisted in the Glens of Antrim right up until the 1890s, so it's not that unusual there. Alice Milligan, one of Casement's friends whom I mentioned earlier, documents the education exchange, as we would call it today, that she set up in order to learn how to speak Irish. Her teacher was a shopkeeper who was illiterate, so she taught him to read and write, and he taught her conversation and pronunciation, so it was, a class exchange as well. Surviving written exchanges between members of Casement's coterie focus on what was called the de-Anglicisation of Ireland. This is Hyde's term. Their letters almost always open with a salutation in Irish. And those of you who are paying attention to the signatories, the Irish signatories that Jane showed earlier, will have seen uncial or Irish script being used in some of them, and many of these letters use uncial as well rather than Roman script. The Gaelicisation of their names is interesting too, I think. It's evident in Ada MacNeil's switch from Ada to Ida. Adopting the Irish language version of their names or changing their names was consistent with their sense of being engaged in a project to reinvent the culture. So Rose Young wrote under the name Roche Neogon. The Bannister sisters changed their names from Gertrude, these very English names, to Una and Eilish. Margaret Dobbs became a Rave, and so on. So they took the Irish language version of their names in a very deliberately political move. Such name changing is common also among new woman writers, who frequently wrote under pseudonyms, though as a mark of their feminist adherence they took feminine names. So it's not like the Georges of another era who obscured their names under masculine names. So Sarah Grand wasn't the real name of Frances Bellenden Clark. So there's name changing going on. So it seems to me that there's a distinct sense of new identities being assumed and a community of interest being forged by the use of these new names. Rejecting their given names and the ideological adherence of their families, these Glens women rejected patriarchal authority in other ways. They often chose not to marry, opted for public careers as political activists, scholars, and writers. This contradicts received ideas of the period in which Irish patriotism and masculinity were often seen as indivisible. But throughout the 1890s then, Antrim had become really a hive of radical activity, much of it focused on on cultural nationalism. So the Gaelic League and the Henry Joy McCracken Literary Society, which links nicely to Jane's comments earlier on Wolfe Tone, ran classes, lectures and reading groups. Many new members were attracted to the Gaelic League because they were members of the Belfast Naturalist Field Club, which obviously was interested in exploring the natural landscape, but was also interested in the history and heritage of that place. So you have women joining the Gaelic League to learn Irish, often graduating to teach classes and ultimately to carrying out research and writing in the field. Casement's confidant, Margaret Dobbs, her dates are 1871 to 1962, made a lifelong study of the Irish language. Her many publications, and you can find them in the National Library, include Sidelights on the Táin Age and Other Stories in 1917, numerous editions of Irish language texts, a range of essays, a huge amount of ephemera in historical and archaeological journals, in international philological journals, as well as 7 plays. Dobbs moved to Glenariff in 1898. Along with her friend Ada MacNeil, she became a central figure in the Glens group. Dobbs' commitment to both Gaelic culture and feminist principles are evident in the introduction to her edition of the Ban Shankas, which was in Irish with her English translations on facing pages. And she describes this openly in the introduction as a history of women. Dobbs' family origins were staunchly unionist. There was little Irish language culture or tradition in her family. Self-taught, she later taught Irish at some of these summer schools on Rathlin and at Goethe Herk. She also funded scholarships to the Gaeltacht. The educative function of her publications is clear, so we get that English language translation for those who have no access to Irish going on. And she explains things. There are lots of footnotes in her edition of the Ban Shankas. She's giving you the early history that you don't already have, Dobbs had the liberty and means to pursue a fairly single-minded commitment to the language movement, and her home in Port Nagolan, Cushendall, was central to all of the cultural nationalist activities in North Antrim. She was a founding member of the FFLCH committee in 1904 and really very close to Casement. Like Dobbs, many of Casement's cohort in North Antrim came from Protestant Unionist families. In her later reminiscences of Casement, Eda MacNeill wrote, "I was in a Unionist milieu, and Roger was too, on the Ballycastle side of the mountain," which I was taught to pronounce locally as Ballycastle, but I don't think I can really do it justice. "It's not surprising we made friends," she said. Rose Young's brother George was an Orangeman. He was the County Grand Master of Antrim and the Unionist MP for Bandside. And I'm fascinated to know what kind of Christmas dinner conversations were had in these houses between these radical nationalist women and their Orange brothers, you know. During the political upheavals of the early 20th century, many of these Glens families then were split ideologically, the men continuing to support the Union, the women joining the Gaelic League, and openly espousing what were then called separatist views, so Irish nationalist views. Such women were no different to their peers whose names are more familiar to us in the narrative of the Irish struggle for independence. So obviously Con Markievicz, Albinia Broderick and so on, in having Protestant ascendancy backgrounds. Middle-class Protestant families too produced their fair share of Irish rebels, and Mabel McConnell, the Belfast-born Mabel McConnell, is probably the best known of these. She says she encountered Irish nationalist politics for the first time at Queen's in Belfast. She later commented, "I seem to base all my friendships in nationalism. Other things are as important, but not nearly as much so." As Jeff Dudgeon observes, the culturally minded sons and daughters of Ulster's Protestants have in every generation, with monotonous regularity, either emigrated or followed the path set by Bulmer Hobson and Alice Milligan into radical nationalism. But despite this openness to diversity among members of the revolutionary generation, as we learned earlier, the subsequent partition of the island and sectarianism, north and south, made northern Protestant contributions to Irish nationalism more difficult to perceive and commemorate. It's only quite recently, for instance, that the Irish language has begun to be spoken in East Belfast, that part of the city that's traditionally associated with unionism, Protestant unionism and loyalism. In the intervening century, what were seen as the divided loyalties of the northern Protestant nationalists were often forcefully rejected by members of their own communities. And to me, the most poignant example of this is the destruction, the actual destruction of the memorial stone marking Francis Biggar's grave. So he had a Celtic cross marking his grave, which was blown up by loyalist paramilitaries in 1980. And the fact that Casement has never been reburied in beautiful Murlock Bay has a lot more to do with contemporary political divisions than anything else. So Eda MacNeill, I think is a good example of these divided families. She was a first cousin of Ronald MacNeill, Lord Cushendun, who was very close to both Carson and Craig. Eda was an early member of the Gaelic League. She was a fluent Irish speaker and an enthusiastic member of the Glens FFLCH committee. And an ardent Republican in later life. MacNeill attributed her interest in all of this to Casement. When they became acquainted in Antrim, they were both in their early 20s, he provoked her to an interest in Irish culture that was entirely new to her. She says, "We were a horrid, cynical, transplanted family. In the West Highland homes of the past, we would have been among our own set." So the two went walking. They were big into hill walking across the glens. But these walks were ideological battles, she says. In 1929, she writes, she remembers them. She says, "Roger had the history of Ireland at his finger ends. We argued and fought out the battles of long ago. I criticised the Irish side, but he always made excuses for them." And at the end of this section, which is quite long, and I won't quote the whole thing, she says, "I learned a lot like this and to read for myself." And it seems to me that this is the crucial point here. These women were learning to read for themselves in those years, to deconstruct the colonial world they'd inherited from their planter families. By the time MacNeill reconnected with Casement in the early 20th century, so when he went to the Congo, they lost touch for some time. But when they kind of came back into contact together, Ada was already an ardent member of the Gaelic League. And she recalls that her very first attempt at a letter in the Gaelic, as she says, was written to Casement from the Aran Islands. And so this is her description of the spirit that, as she says, was awakening in Ireland, even in the sleepy old glens. And she's talking here about the preparations for the Glens Feis in 1904. Among this group of women, Alice Green is the one we really must turn to as if not the key influence on Casement's radical thinking. Green's dates are 1847 to 1929. And when Alice Green arrived in the Glens of Antrim for the 1904 Feis, she was the last piece, she was the missing piece in the jigsaw that brought this radical group together. A hugely influential figure in Casement's radicalisation, Green was a well-known nationalist historian whose homes in London and on Stephen's Green in Dublin were salons for nationalist radicals. This quote, I think, gives us a sense, of Alice Green's personality. And I'll let you read that for yourselves. So just to give you an idea that the flaming red hair wasn't just an aside earlier. I think it maybe refers to her temperament a little bit as well. So, Casement was an avid reader, and obviously all of us who travel know how much time you have on your own to read, to write, and so on, but especially on these long sea journeys that Casement made. So Green's reputation and her clear sense of a mission to correct received ideas about Ireland in her books, those ideas about Ireland as an uncivilised place in the period before colonisation, had to impress him, and not to mention her rejection of Anglicisation. In 1911, she wrote, "The child who knew only Irish was given a teacher who knew nothing but English. His history book mentioned Ireland only twice, a place conquered by Henry II and made into an English province by the Union. The Irish boy was taught to thank God for being a happy English child." And I'll just go back, and this is another part of the letter that I was looking at earlier, and this is just the second section of that. So in which Casement says, "I was taught nothing about Ireland at Ballymena School." So what he's reading, what Alice Stopford Green is feeding him, if you like, in those books, is the education that he's been looking for, is that background that he's been looking for. And at the end, he talks about patriotism. He says patriotism has been stigmatised and treated as treason, as a crime, or dismissed with superior scorn as local. That local adherence of his friends in the Glens, of course, was threatening to their unionist families and context, because it subverted the colonial rendering of the past, through which Indigenous Irish history had become folklore, and its civilisation barbarous. Having first made contact with Alice Green through Edmund Morel, they became firm friends, and Casement wrote many homesick letters to her from his various postings abroad. They were intellectually and ideologically compatible in various ways. Her influence on his emerging nationalist sensibilities is beyond question, while his humanitarian efforts and commitment to the anti-slavery movement chimed with her liberalism. In other circumstances, they would have made a striking couple. Casement's dark features and charisma were well matched by her natural vitality and massive red hair. Her biographer, Orby MacDowell, describes her as having a decided sense of fun. From the story she records in her diary, she must have read Punch with gusto, he says. This is the satirical magazine. And she was quick to perceive and enjoy the incongruities and absurdities of human behaviour. So you have two highly charismatic, highly charged individuals. They shared an acute understanding of the close connections between colonial occupation and the exploitation of Indigenous labour. The historian Margaret O'Callaghan observes that Casement bombarded his acquaintances with Green's writings, and Dudgeon describes him as having taken on the role of a one-man publicity department and distributor for her 1911 book Irish Nationality. I think I have that here. Do I have that? This is from the 1912 one. Just to give you a little sense, the historians will appreciate this, I think. This is my sop to the historians in the room. Just to give you a sense of her writing. So she's looking at that kind of pre-colonial period and looking at how the society was set up at the time. So these two people then, coming into close contact with one another, really ignited the group around them in the Glens. And much of this ignition, if you like, is done via letter writing. in the period. You know, I've looked at some of these letters, and really the extent of them would make an ardent Facebooker jealous, you know, because they're documenting every single thing they do all the time. So the range of countercultural projects involving this network was sustained by those letters then. Letters between the Glens and like-minded individuals in Dublin, London, and where Casement was concerned, the Putumayo. Book lists and poems were exchanged, books reviewed, and so on. Many of the letters refer to the bilingual project. They talk about problems in finding teachers for Irish schools or the difficulties in finding financial support for Gaeltacht schools. While the focus of their exchanges is usually on the language revival, there's also an abiding interest in philanthropy, in stimulating local industries, and an understanding, I think a very incisive understanding, of the material realities of life in remote regions. Moving between the Glens, the west of Ireland, and the wider colonial world in the period enabled Casement to draw keen-eyed comparisons between typhus outbreaks in Connemara and the Putumayo, and between Irish poverty and the enslavement of indigenous peoples under colonialism. His comment about the white Indians of Connemara, which he described as the Irish Putumayo, is a clear example of this, it seems to me. Just as he had earlier committed himself to the re-education of Ada MacNeill, his prodigious letter writing meant that his New Woman network in the Glens had access to his ideas and to his perception of social injustice in the wider world. And moreover, his achievements in highlighting human rights abuses in the Congo and so on and the Putumayo encouraged these women to believe that where political will is available, social change is possible. The Glens women put this awareness to very good use. They brought their own capacity to bear in their efforts to right local wrongs. And this is an undated letter from Gertrude Bannister. It's after Casement's death, where she's seeking support for Aran Island schools. And she talks about Casement's intervention. When Roger Casement visited the islands in 1913, his heart was moved with pity, and so on. So their willingness to carry on consciousness raising, if you like, in his name to achieve, you know, if you like, equal rights and foster the Irish language, show the extent to which social change was a central motivating principle of this group. Okay, let me talk a little bit about the FESH. I know that many of you will know about this already. The inaugural FESH then in 1904 brought what we would call these modern attitudes and ancient Gaelic ideals, as Dobbs calls them, into sharp focus. Margaret Dobbs credits Francis Bigger with the idea for the FESH when on holiday in Cushendun. And their intervention brought this huge audience of people to the Glens. This is one of the banners, and this is the parade, if you like, that they make into Waterfoot. And if you look very closely through your spyglass, you'll see a man wearing a Panama hat in the background, and this is Casement overlooking the parade from as they move in to Waterfoot. So, you know, they have, it's the arts and crafts movement. It's William Morris influenced. You have the banners from each of the glens, the kind of, you know, all of this going on as well. And that audience of 2,000 people in this very, very small place that's kind of hard to find even in the Glens of Antrim, brought together the Gaelic League, key figures in the Gaelic League, the Gaelic Athletic Association, antiquarian societies, as well as writers, actors, musicians and dancers. Crucially, it provided an encounter between revivalists, as they were called, and traditional work practices, so the arts and crafts of the local area, the Irish speakers in the area. Casement himself paid the boatmen to bring the islanders across from Rathlin, from the Rackery people. And so, you know, you have a kind of a coming together, a gathering, if you like, of all of these different kinds of people into this one small rural place on the northeast coast at that time. So they have competitions. It's a usual festival, fesh type thing, with Irish dancing competitions, music, language, history, as well as a local industries section. There was a hurling match on the beach, which was won by Kerry Fox, and I think it's funny that Casement was one of the umpires of the match. And if anyone is interested in hurling in the area, I can tell you a bit more about that later. But there were prizes awarded, and Horace Plunkett, who founded the cooperative movement in agriculture, presented some prizes, as did Owen MacNeill and Stephen Gwynn in language and literature. So its place, the place of the Glens Feis, is assured in cultural nationalism, in those who are interested in working on the revival in Ireland. But it seems to me that the Feis had a wider reaching significance. It was crucial in cementing relationships and thereby facilitating further exchanges of ideas and strategies between its main actors. So it seems to me that it's part of that mobilising narrative for Irish political independence, and in some ways even simply in bringing these people together to this place at that time is instrumental in doing that. So you may well ask, where did all of these scholars and artists, these activist sisters, these warrior women disappear to in the intervening century, such that their names have vanished, more or less, with the exception of one or two? And why is that even in connection with major figures like Casement, they're not given due recognition today? This is the bit where I wish I was standing behind the thing, because I'm not sure. Yeah, so just some more pictures from the Glens to entertain you near the end. So obviously this isn't just an Irish problem. In particular, women's experience of and active participation in armed struggle is consistently ignored or rendered invisible. Cook and Wallacott describe the historical constructedness of the war story that must eliminate the feminine in order to survive. And moreover, women's writing about contemporary or past conflicts is often invisible. Even a recent article that some of you may have seen in the Guardian newspaper looked at why it is that women writing about history, particularly writing about war, are often really, ignored. In addition to that, the few Irish revolutionary women who are written about and who are remembered today, if you think about, Maud Gonne and Constance Markievicz, have assumed an iconographic, quasi-mythological status almost. And so they're rendered exceptional by virtue of their class or their masculine warlike ambition or something. Annette Weber describes this tendency to portray female warriors as temporary transgressors, which means that fixed gender binaries in our construction of the past aren't disrupted. This flies in the face of clear evidence to the contrary, as Margaret Ward's groundbreaking study on manageable revolutionaries demonstrated, along with subsequent research by Sinead McCool, Roy Foster, Lucy McDermott, Sania Pacetta, and so on, that augments our understanding of the scale of women's involvement in the Irish revolutionary period. That subsequent patrilineal plotting fixes women in more traditional roles in revolutionary Irish culture is especially ironic, it seems to me, given the opening up of gendered spaces in early 20th century Ireland that I talked about earlier and that several of us have spoken about here in the last few days. This is not to mention the interrogation of fixed ideas about militarisms and masculinities in the literature of the period. So we might read the recent silencing of women's voices in Irish commemorative programmes, as mentioned earlier, as a missed opportunity to change the way we read and write the war story and to reassess ideological constructions through which the political struggles of the period have been conceptualised, whether nationally or transnationally. As I suggested at the outset, by focusing on Casement as a member of a community, this work aims to de-emphasise the great man school of thought that presents such figures as exceptional and existing in isolation. Furthermore, it extends recent paradigm shifts that open up late 19th and early 20th century Ireland to feminist and queer scrutiny. In some ways, that work rejects an old school approach that tended to define itself by those it excluded rather than those it included, by an expansive welcoming of difference and wider possibility. So developing these kinds of readings of Casement's life, and I've only given you a tiny snippet of this, there's a lot more work for a lot of other people who are here to do. It seems to me that looking at his work in tandem with the letters, with the Irish language work, with the reports that he's done with poetry of Alice Green and of these other new women, reveals a vibrant community of interest. I work on a range of different kinds of projects. As we know, despite the political and cultural radicalism then of the period, as Casement and his contemporaries called for total reorganisation, if you like, of the Irish social world, the two new states founded on the island of Ireland proved to be repressive and socially conservative. Over the course of the 20th century, received ideas about the revolutionary period were constrained and their radical proposals tamped down. Too long a sacrifice, Yeats tells us, can make a stone of the heart. And following 2 devastating civil wars on the island, one not really quite finished yet, and the economic and cultural stagnation of the early, newly liberated Irish Republic, the revolutionary promise of the early 20th century was lost. And it seems apposite to me to end with the words of Eva Gore Booth. Her elegy, which some of you may know for Roger Casement, gives us some access, I think, a little, to that broken generation of women who were left to pick up the pieces in the wake of the executions and the ensuing civil war. So don't worry, Laura, I'm not going to read the whole poem, I'm just going to read a little bit of it. We will be here all day. So Eva Gore Booth writes, I dream of one who is dead, as the forms of green trees float and fall in the water, the dreams float and fall in my mind. I dream of our hopes and our fears, the long, bitter struggle of the broken-hearted with hearts that were poisoned and hard. I dream of one who is dead, above dreams that fall and float and fall in the water, a new star shines in my mind. Thank you. Happy to take questions if anybody. I've put everyone to sleep. Yes, sure, by all means, yeah. Whatever you like, yeah. Sure. I always get nervous when a historian puts up his hand, you know.
20 years. Fascinating. I've been introduced recently to some of the women that you mentioned. The list is much longer.
Yeah.
I have 100 questions, but I'll try and think of some that might be relevant for today. You mentioned that the creation of the 2 states on the island in the 20s perhaps caused a drying up of a cultural space, if I can be diplomatic about it. Would you say that the states that came into being in the 20s were any less culturally restrictive than the administration that went before for the whole island? Because these women emerged during a period of radicalization in a system that wasn't especially liberal, but might have been perhaps a bit more laissez-faire than the states that came after. And then linked in with that, a lot of the women who were involved in the struggle, for whatever reason, ended up or were portrayed as ending up on the losing side of the Civil War. And portrayed as radicalized and irrational. Is that deliberate, or did more of the women who were involved continue to insist that the struggle wasn't over and they had to keep going?
Yeah, it's a great question. I suppose I'm particularly interested. In some ways, that's where this project started, because I looked at those embittered, hard women who would never give up and who were there in the widow's weeds and went every day to the Dáil or whatever, you know. And I thought, God, there has to be more to this story than just that. Obviously, some of those women were widows of men who were executed. Others, I mean, you know, it's really interesting to read the personal writing of people like Doris Sigerson Shorter, for instance, who was just broken, who frankly committed suicide, I think, in the aftermath of the execution. So I do think they were hardened by their experience of what had happened. I think the emotional effect of all of that on this generation of women who hadn't gone out to fight, who hadn't, you know, maybe some of them did, but a small minority, was just, you know, almost overwhelming in some ways. I also think, I mean, you know, we all know what this is like. Anyone who's ever been involved in any kind of activism, you know, we always tend to have a bit of a romantic idealism about us, however cynical we like to think we are. So I think when you see the hope and the aspiration of this whole period, and then where it ends, you know, in a jailer's yard or, you know, in the Tower of London, there's a crushing reality maybe to what happens. So I really see that early 20th century period as not just one of economic stagnation, but also one of emotional, just of loss, of bereavement, of death and so on. But then, like Luke was talking earlier about Dorothy McArdle, so we also have other writers who are yet to be looked at, who are yet to be fully explored, who are coming along in the 20th century, and who for whatever reason our education system forgot about along the way, so we don't know what they are. I've now forgotten what your first question was, Brian. Okay. It might be better. It might be better that way. Oh, I know. Yes. No, I mean, yeah, I think it's a laissez-faire thing. I think what you're looking at is this much bigger system that isn't attending to when everyone is scrutinising. Yeah, but also remember in the post-colonial kind of situation, everything is being scrutinised so carefully. Your morals, your way of being, your Catholicism, your how you fit in. I mean, some of the comments that Jane made this morning, about that, just that forgotten Protestant impetus, it can't be part of the society that we found, So it's not really an answer, but it's a thought.
I think one aspect that you bring out, and it might be worth emphasising more, is how much the female contributions to the national revival can be seen as modernist.
Yes, yeah.
In other words, there's a tendency to see the revival in romantic terms, and to see it as the backward look, and to see it as very much almost in a continuum with Victorian notions of chivalry and but what comes through these figures is that and there's a controversial argument that the daughter figure in the Irish family is on the side of modernity. She has the least to gain by the status quo and by shoring up the conservative kind of value system, especially and that ironically the mother figure might be the most conservative figure.
Yes.
So it's kind of interesting that when the female organisation was founded, it was called Daughters.
Yes, in Éireann, yeah.
While the men were writing about Mother Ireland, the daughters were getting on with the job.
They were the revolting daughters from the 1890s.
Of being not dutiful daughters, but rebel daughters.
Yes.
And they were more conversant with new media technologies, with new forms of publications, with the Magic Lantern shows, with film, with photography. And in a sense, you could argue that a lot of these women were, in fact, kind of the modernizing influences.
Yes.
Not the sole ones, but key modernizing influences on the revival. So could you say just one thing about periodicals and publications? Because if I'm not mistaken, Alice Milligan's publication, the Shan Van Vogt, Poor Old Woman, is now available online.
That's right, yeah.
And could you say something about how we say students who cannot get to Ireland,
good idea,
who might want to research some of this material, including the novels? I mean, getting access to the New Woman novels online. Could you just say something about that?
Sure, thanks for the question, Luke. Yeah, I mean, actually, surprisingly in some ways, obviously a lot of the New Woman material is very difficult to get in hardcover, but a lot of, I mean, we were talking about George Edgerton earlier, who's obviously my pet writer. A lot of her short stories are available digitally, so Project Gutenberg, which I'm sure some of you will already know, Maria Rita's nodding vigorously, but yeah, so I mean, Project Gutenberg is a really useful way in, and as you say, I mean, periodicals in the period, like the Shan Van Vogt, really give us access to some of that. I keep coming back, I'm slightly distracted because I always keep coming back to the figure of Dante in Portrait, who is that bitter Republican woman who, or if you like, she would be in a later generation, who's holding on, and that kind of forgotten daughter figure is really key, I think, there, and has been rendered invisible, I think, for a long time, yeah. But yeah, I mean, to go back to your question, I mean, you will find, I mean, even some of the journalistic writings of Con Markiewicz and people like this, you will find this material online, and I really can't recommend highly enough the National Library of Ireland website, because more and more and more material is becoming digitised. Some of you will already be familiar with the Century Ireland project, which Mike Cronin from Boston College spearheaded, which is really putting great materials online, and it's across the board, sort of politically, you know, it's involving all of the different kinds of activist groups of the period. Can you think of other examples, Luke, yourself?
Well, the very modernist publication, Dana, which was the one that turned down Joyce for its troubles. It's available. the full run is available.
It's
online.
available, is it? Okay.
In
okay.
American Modernist, in an American Modernist series. And the most interesting one is probably the Irish Review, which was edited by Mary Collum, Porry Collum's wife, but who's now becoming more famous than Porry Collum, because Mary Collum was probably the first feminist literary critic in the 20th century, let alone in Ireland. You know, Virginia Woolf criticised her for being engaged in criticism. What was a woman engaged in criticism?
Right, well.
And Mary Collum said, well, I beg to differ. Women can do criticism every bit as much. And Tina, you've just shown an example of how women can do criticism. So thanks for that.
You're very good. Thank you very much. Can I get off the hook? Oh, sure. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to be rude at all. It may not carry to the back, though.
I just wanted to know whether you have published any works, articles about the specific theme of your talk.
I have a forthcoming essay. It's not out just yet, but I'm co-editing a book called Women and War, Ireland 1880 to 1922, which is coming out with UCD Press this year. So some of this material will be in that essay. So watch the UCD Press. I can't give you a month. It's the usual thing with publishers, you know. Okay.
Thank you very much, Tina, for your fascinating lecture, placing the women's side of the program. That's very important.
Thank you.
Very much.